Hi guys, tonight we begin the calm story of Al Capone, the man who became the symbol of organised crime in Chicago. From the shadows of the streets to the glittering clubs of the Prohibition era, his name carried both fear and fascination. He was a figure who ruled not only through violence but also through charm, strategy, and an empire built in the most turbulent years of America. This journey will take us slowly through his rise, his reign, and his fall. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17th, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents Gabriele and Teresa Capone. His father worked as a barber and his mother as a seamstress. The Capone family lived modestly, like many immigrant families who had come to America in search of better opportunities. Their neighborhood was filled with different immigrant groups, and it was in this diverse environment that young Al learned to navigate different cultures and personalities. From an early age, Capone showed signs of being both clever and impulsive. He attended school, but he struggled with discipline. At the age of 14, after hitting a teacher who had struck him, he was expelled and never returned to formal education. This left him with limited options, and soon he began to spend more time on the streets, where the influence of gangs was strong. In Brooklyn at the turn of the century, gangs provided not only a sense of belonging but also a way to earn money and status. Capone first became associated with small-time street gangs, learning the codes of loyalty, toughness, and ambition. One of the earliest and most important influences on him was Johnny Torrio, a man who would later become his mentor. Torrio was intelligent, organised, and far more strategic than many of the rough street thugs. He saw in Capone a young man with potential, someone who could be shaped into more than just muscle. Around this time, Capone gained his infamous nickname Scarface. While working as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a bar owned by gangster Frankie Yale, Capone insulted a woman. Her brother retaliated by slashing Capone's face with a knife, leaving 3 distinct scars. Capone hated the nickname and preferred to be called Big Al by his friends, but the name Scarface followed him throughout his life. Despite the scars, his charm remained one of his strongest weapons. He knew how to smile, how to talk, and how to make people trust him, even while he was climbing through the dangerous world of crime. In the early years, Capone did not immediately rise to great power. He worked in various roles under Yale, learning how bars and gambling houses operated, how protection rackets were run, and how to keep police and politicians satisfied with bribes. These lessons became the foundation of his later empire. By 1919, things began to change. Prohibition was about to take effect, banning the sale and production of alcohol. For gangsters, this was not a setback, but a golden opportunity. Torrio, who had moved to Chicago, invited Capone to join him there. Chicago was booming, with a rapidly growing population, political corruption, and a thirst for entertainment. It was the perfect place for an ambitious young man like Capone to build his future. Accepting Torrio's invitation, Capone left New York behind and set his sights on Chicago, a city that would soon come to know his name more than any other. As the train carried him westward, Capone could not have imagined that within a few short years he would become the most feared and most famous gangster in America. For now, he was simply a young man, eager, scarred, and ready to follow his mentor into a new world of opportunity. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, the city was already a restless and divided place. The skyline was growing with modern buildings, but the streets told a different story, one of poverty, corruption, and the hunger for escape from daily struggles. Prohibition was about to begin, and with it came a market no law could fully control. Johnny Torrio welcomed Capone into his organization, which at the time was still under the shadow of Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo ran brothels and gambling houses, but he was cautious, preferring steady profits to risky ventures. Torrio, however, saw the upcoming ban on alcohol as a chance to expand far beyond what Colosimo envisioned. Capone started out quietly, helping Torrio manage operations. He worked as a bouncer, sometimes a driver, and sometimes as muscle. But what set him apart was his ability to balance intimidation with charm. He could be ruthless when necessary, yet he also knew how to make deals, smooth over conflicts, and convince men to follow his lead. His scars gave him a reputation of toughness, while his easy smile made him approachable in a world where fear usually ruled. In 1920, the Volstead Act went into effect, officially prohibiting the sale of alcohol. Almost overnight, alcohol became the most valuable illegal commodity in America. Speakeasies popped up across Chicago, hidden behind restaurant doors or basements, each needing a steady supply. Torrio, unlike Colosimo, was eager to enter this business. Colosimo, however, resisted, fearing the danger and attention it might bring. This disagreement would soon become fatal for him. In May 1920, Colosimo was lured to his cafe with promises of a shipment arriving. Instead, he was shot dead in the vestibule. The identity of the gunman has never been proven, but many historians believe that Torrio orchestrated the murder, with Capone playing a part in arranging the meeting. After Colosimo's death, Torrio took over the organization, and Capone quickly became his right-hand man. Their empire began to shift toward the bootlegging trade. Chicago was an ideal hub. Connected by railroads, lakes and highways, it allowed liquor to flow from Canada and rural distilleries into the heart of the city. Capone oversaw shipments, bribed police officers, and coordinated deliveries to countless bars and clubs. It was during these years that his reputation grew beyond the underworld. People in Chicago knew his name, whether they admired him for providing alcohol or feared him for the violence that surrounded his business. By 1923, Capone had moved his family, his wife May and young son Sonny, into a comfortable house in Cicero, a suburb west of Chicago. Cicero soon became the stronghold of the Capone empire. Away from the watchful eyes of downtown authorities, Capone turned the town into his own base, filling it with speakeasies, brothels, and gambling halls. Politicians in Cicero learned quickly that cooperating with Capone meant power and wealth, while resisting him often meant violence. This was the environment in which Capone began to grow not only as Torrio's trusted lieutenant, but also as a figure in his own right, a man who was already preparing for the day when he would no longer serve under anyone. By the mid-1920s, Cicero was no longer just a quiet suburb. It had become the heart of Al Capone's growing empire. Speakeasies lined the streets, gambling dens thrived in back rooms, and brothels operated openly under police protection. The transformation of Cicero into a criminal stronghold did not happen overnight. It was carefully engineered through bribery, intimidation, and sometimes outright violence. Politicians who resisted found themselves threatened, beaten, or simply removed from office. In 1924, during local elections, Capone and his men openly interfered at polling stations. Rival candidates were assaulted, ballots were stolen, and voters were intimidated until Capone's chosen officials won. That election marked the moment when Capone's control over Cicero became absolute. From then on, the town was run on his terms, with law enforcement acting less like protectors of the public and more like employees of his organization. Despite this dark undercurrent, Capone maintained a strange kind of popularity. For many ordinary people, especially during the dry years of Prohibition, he was seen as someone who provided what the public secretly wanted. Alcohol flowed freely in his establishments, and those who had money to spend could find entertainment without fear of scarcity. Capone became known as a man who not only ruled with power, but also shared his wealth. He was known to hand out large tips, buy drinks for entire crowds, and even give money to families in need. Stories of his generosity spread quickly, and for many they softened the image of a gangster into something closer to a folk hero. Yet behind that image, violence remained ever present. Rival gangs also wanted control of Chicago's lucrative bootlegging routes. The North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, was one of the most powerful rivals. Tensions between Torrio's operation and O'Banion's men escalated quickly. O'Banion was bold and reckless, and he openly mocked Torrio in public, which Capone did not forget. In November 1924, O'Banion was lured into his flower shop by 3 men posing as customers. He was shot dead in an attack that shocked the city. Though Capone was not the triggerman, the killing deepened his involvement in the cycle of violence that now defined Chicago's underworld. The murder of O'Banion set off a chain reaction. The North Side gang struck back, targeting Torrio himself. In early 1925, Torrio was ambushed outside his home. He survived but was badly injured, and the attack shook him deeply. Realizing that his days of active leadership were over, Torrio made a surprising decision. He retired from the business, returning to Italy to live quietly. With Torrio gone, leadership of the empire passed directly to Al Capone. At just 26 years old, Capone now controlled the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago. The moment marked the beginning of his true reign, one that would turn him into the most recognized name in America's criminal history. From the quiet barber's son in Brooklyn to the undisputed leader of Chicago's underworld, Capone had climbed higher and faster than anyone expected, and his story was only just beginning. When Johnny Torrio stepped aside in 1925, the transfer of power to Al Capone was smooth but significant. Torrio's empire was already vast, stretching across Chicago with breweries, distilleries, gambling houses, and brothels. Yet what Torrio had built carefully and quietly, Capone would expand loudly and boldly. At 26, Capone was younger than many rivals, but he had a rare combination of toughness, charisma, and vision. He understood that organized crime was not just about muscle. It was about image, strategy, and influence. Capone moved his headquarters into the luxurious Metropole Hotel in downtown Chicago. From there, he held meetings, entertained guests, and directed operations as though he were a businessman rather than a criminal. He dressed in expensive tailored suits, wore diamond rings, and drove flashy cars, cultivating the look of success. To the public, he projected the image of a man who had made it in America, a symbol of power and wealth. To his men, he was a leader who rewarded loyalty generously but punished betrayal without hesitation. Under Capone's rule, the scale of bootlegging expanded dramatically. Truckloads of liquor were smuggled from Canada across the Great Lakes, while hidden breweries in Chicago churned out beer. Distribution networks stretched through the city's neighborhoods, ensuring that no speakeasy ran dry. Police officers were routinely paid off to look the other way, and judges received envelopes of cash to dismiss charges. This system of bribery became so widespread that it was said half of Chicago's law enforcement worked indirectly for Capone. Despite the corruption, Capone insisted on order within his organization. Violence was used strategically, not recklessly, though the sheer size of the empire made conflict inevitable. Rivals such as the North Side gang refused to surrender their share of the market. Street battles, ambushes, and drive-by shootings became common, with Chicago newspapers reporting on them almost daily. The city's nickname, the Windy City, seemed to take on a darker meaning, as gunfire echoed through its streets. Yet Capone himself managed to maintain a surprising degree of public approval. He opened soup kitchens during hard winters, provided turkeys for the poor on holidays, and often spoke of himself as a public benefactor. To many struggling families, especially during the economic hardships of the 1920s, Capone seemed more generous than politicians. This dual image, public hero to some, ruthless gangster to others, became a defining part of his legacy. By the late 1920s, Capone was not only the ruler of Chicago's underworld, but also one of the most famous men in America. Newspapers followed his every move, sometimes criticizing, sometimes sensationalizing, but always keeping his name in print. For Capone, publicity was a weapon. He knew that fame made him untouchable in some ways, but it also brought scrutiny he could not escape forever. By 1926, Al Capone's empire was running at full speed. Breweries operated secretly in warehouses, trucks delivered alcohol through carefully guarded routes, and speakeasies filled with music and laughter became the heartbeat of Chicago's nightlife. Capone had perfected the balance of intimidation and business. He used violence when necessary, but most of his power came from his ability to organize, to bribe, and to keep his network loyal, every layer of the city seemed touched by his hand. From street-level bartenders to police officers, city council members, and even judges who quietly accepted his influence. Yet with success came danger. The murder of Dino Banyan had left the Northside gang leaderless, but soon Jaime Weiss stepped up to fill the void. Weiss was intelligent and fearless, and he hated Capone with intensity. Street wars between the two factions escalated, leaving bodies on sidewalks and drawing headlines that spread far beyond Chicago. In September 1926, Capone himself became the target. As he dined at the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, a convoy of cars pulled up outside. Gunmen unleashed a hail of bullets, spraying the building with machine gun fire. Glass shattered, walls cracked, and the street filled with chaos. Capone survived by diving to the floor and escaping through the kitchen, but the message was clear. His enemies would stop at nothing. The attack shook him, but it also strengthened his resolve. From then on, Capone surrounded himself with bodyguards, travelling in armoured cars and never staying in one place too long. Despite the dangers, Capone continued to grow his operations. His organisation made millions each year, and with money came greater influence. He entertained politicians, journalists, and even celebrities, who were drawn to his charm and reputation. Newspapers painted him as a paradox, a man capable of brutal violence, yet also a devoted family man who lived with his wife May and their son Sonny. This duality fascinated the public, keeping his name in constant circulation. Capone understood the power of the press. Sometimes he invited reporters to dine with him, giving them quotes that blended humour with menace. Other times, he let them photograph him in fine suits, smiling as though he were simply a successful businessman. To the outside world, it often seemed as though Capone thrived on the attention, as if every headline added to his power. But beneath the surface, the constant battles with rivals and the growing scrutiny from authorities began to take their toll. Each attempt on his life reminded him that even kings of the underworld were not invincible. Still, in the mid-1920s, Al Capone stood taller than any rival. He had transformed from Torrio's apprentice into the undisputed master of Chicago's underworld, a man whose reach extended into every corner of the city. By 1927, Al Capone's empire had become one of the largest criminal organizations in the country. Estimates suggested that his operations were bringing in more than $60 million a year, an unimaginable fortune at the time. The profits came not only from bootlegging but also from gambling, prostitution and protection rackets that stretched across the city. Chicago had become a patchwork of neighborhoods, each under the watch of Capone's men, with money flowing upward into his pockets. Despite the bloodshed that sometimes erupted in the streets, Capone insisted that his empire functioned like a business. He kept detailed records of shipments, ensured reliable distribution, and demanded loyalty from those who worked for him. Unlike some gangsters who relied purely on fear, Capone rewarded those who proved useful. Many of his men remained devoted to him for years, willing to fight and even die for the empire he had built. Yet, his greatest challenge remained the Northside Gang. After Jaime Weiss was killed in 1926, leadership passed to Bugs Moran, a gangster with a sharp temper and relentless ambition. Moran despised Capone and made no secret of his intent to destroy him. Battles between their gangs turned Chicago into what newspapers called a war zone. Drive-by shootings, ambushes and bombings became so common that ordinary citizens grew used to the sound of gunfire echoing through the night. The authorities, often on Capone's payroll, seemed powerless to stop the violence. Still, Capone maintained an odd kind of public persona. He attended baseball games, sat in the stands with ordinary fans, and cheered loudly for his favourite team, the Chicago Cubs. He was known to buy drinks for entire bars or hand out $100 bills to strangers in need. Reporters described him as a contradiction, ruthless behind closed doors, but almost charming in public. This image kept his popularity alive among many who secretly enjoyed seeing someone defy the law and thrive in the process. Yet even as Capone enjoyed his fame, cracks in his empire began to show. Rival gangs were not his only problem. The federal government was becoming increasingly aware that Chicago's violence threatened the country's sense of order. Journalists published investigative pieces exposing the scale of corruption, and reform movements began to pressure law enforcement to act. Capone's wealth and visibility, once his greatest strengths, were slowly turning into vulnerabilities. For now, however, he still stood at the height of his power. His name was spoken in whispers, with fear and fascination, as the man who ruled Chicago as completely as any king ruled a kingdom. By the late 1920s, Al Capone's fame had spread far beyond Chicago. Newspapers across the country printed his name daily, turning him into a household figure. To some, he was a dangerous criminal, but to others, he was almost a symbol of rebellion against unpopular laws. Prohibition had made ordinary citizens into lawbreakers, and in a strange way, Capone's success seemed to reflect the public's own defiance. Still, the violence of gang wars could not be ignored. Chicago became known for shootings in broad daylight, with bystanders caught in the crossfire. Capone, despite his preference for controlled operations, could not completely restrain his men or his rivals. Blood spilled in the streets was a constant reminder that his empire, while powerful, rested on fragile ground. He responded by strengthening his defences. Capone rarely went anywhere without a convoy of armed bodyguards. His cars were bulletproof, his homes heavily guarded, and his movements unpredictable. He also began to expand his reach into politics more aggressively, ensuring that local officials, police, and even judges were either loyal to him or too afraid to oppose him. Yet Capone was not only a figure of fear, he carefully cultivated an image of generosity. During harsh winters, he opened soup kitchens for the unemployed, serving free meals to thousands of men and women each week. On Thanksgiving, he distributed turkeys to families who could not afford them. These acts of charity were widely reported in the press, reinforcing his image as a man who cared for the poor. Critics dismissed these gestures as public relations, but for those who received food or money, the help was real. This duality fascinated the public. Capone, the ruthless gangster on one side, and Capone, the benefactor, on the other. In 1927, his fortune and influence reached unprecedented heights. He was considered the most powerful underworld figure in America, with connections stretching into New York, Detroit, and beyond. The press sometimes called him the King of Chicago, a title that fed his pride but also attracted growing scrutiny from federal authorities. Prohibition agents, though often bribed, were beginning to coordinate larger efforts against him. At the same time, rivalries within the underworld showed no sign of ending. Bugs Moran and his Northside gang remained determined to challenge Capone's dominance. The stage was being set for one of the most infamous moments in American criminal history, an event that would forever link Capone's name to both terror and legend. For now, though, Capone continued to live as both a king and a target, balancing power, fear, and popularity in a city that seemed to spin endlessly around him. The year 1929 marked a turning point in Al Capone's story, a year that would forever tie his name to one of the most infamous episodes of gangland history. By this time, tensions between Capone and Bugs Moran's Northside gang had reached a breaking point. Both sides were determined to dominate Chicago's bootlegging market, and both had suffered losses in the ongoing war. Capone, though powerful, knew that as long as Moran remained alive, the battles would continue. He began to consider a decisive strike that would cripple his rival once and for all. What followed would later be remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On the morning of February 14th, 1929, 7 members of Moran's gang gathered at a warehouse on North Clark Street. They believed a shipment of liquor was arriving. Instead, 4 men entered, 2 dressed as police officers, 2 in plain clothes. The police ordered Moran's men to line up against a wall. Thinking it was just another raid, they complied. In seconds, the gunmen opened fire with machine guns and shotguns, leaving the men dead in a bloody scene that shocked the nation. Though Moran himself was not present, the massacre destroyed much of his organization's strength. Newspapers exploded with headlines, and the public was horrified. For many Americans, the image of men gunned down in cold blood on a holiday associated with love and affection was almost too much to comprehend. Suspicion immediately fell on Capone, even though he was in Florida at the time, carefully maintaining an alibi. He denied involvement, but few doubted that he had ordered the attack. The massacre cemented his reputation as the most feared gangster in the country. Yet it also brought consequences he had not expected. Public opinion began to shift. For years, many had tolerated Capone's activities or even admired his defiance of prohibition, but the brutality of the massacre turned sympathy into outrage. Politicians, under pressure from angry citizens, could no longer ignore the violence. Federal authorities, already tracking Capone, increased their efforts to bring him down. The massacre also changed the underworld itself. It sent a message that gang wars had reached a new level of brutality, one that threatened not only rivals but the stability of the entire city. Capone, despite his power, found himself more exposed than ever before. His name, once celebrated in headlines for charm and spectacle, was now inseparably linked with cold-blooded murder. He had won a battle against Moran, but in doing so he may have begun the long path toward his eventual downfall. After the Saint, Valentine's Day, massacre, Al Capone's life entered a new phase. He was no longer seen only as a bold bootlegger or a colourful figure in fine suits. To many Americans, he now symbolized the darkest extremes of organized crime. Chicagoans lived in a city that felt under siege, where shootings and bombings no longer shocked, but instead became part of daily life. The massacre drew national attention, and even President Herbert Hoover began to pressure federal agencies to take action against Capone. For the first time, the full weight of the United States government was turning toward a single gangster. Yet in Chicago, Capone continued to live openly, as though untouchable. He moved into the luxurious Lexington Hotel, taking over its upper floors. From this base, he directed operations, received guests, and met with politicians, entertainers, and journalists. His suite became both a fortress and a stage, a place where he could project his image of power. While his enemies plotted in shadows, Capone seemed to thrive in the spotlight, walking through crowds with a smile, shaking hands, and leaving large tips wherever he went. At the same time, he became increasingly cautious about his personal security. The attempt on his life at the Hawthorne Hotel years earlier had left a lasting impression. Now bodyguards surrounded him constantly, armed with shotguns and pistols. His cars were reinforced with steel plating and bulletproof glass. He travelled with convoys, ensuring that no rival could easily ambush him. Despite these precautions, Capone still found time to enjoy luxuries. He loved expensive suits, silk ties, and jewellery. He hosted lavish parties filled with music, food, and endless supplies of alcohol, even while ordinary citizens struggled with the onset of the Great Depression. To his supporters, these displays seemed like proof of success in hard times. To his critics, they were symbols of arrogance and corruption. Capone's complex image fascinated journalists, who often painted him as both a monster and a folk hero. Some articles described him as a modern-day Robin Hood, who helped the poor while defying unfair laws. Others portrayed him as a ruthless tyrant who had turned a great city into a battlefield. The truth lay somewhere between, but the contradiction only fueled his legend. Meanwhile, law enforcement searched for ways to bring him down. Prohibition agents struggled because juries were often bribed or intimidated into acquittals. Local police were deeply entangled in corruption. It became clear that if Capone were to be defeated, it would not be through ordinary charges of bootlegging or violence. Federal authorities began to look elsewhere, into his finances, his taxes, and the paper trail that even the most careful gangster could not erase. By 1930, the walls around Al Capone were beginning to close in. The federal government, frustrated by the endless cycle of corruption in Chicago, realized that direct attacks on his bootlegging empire would likely fail. Witnesses disappeared, juries were compromised, and police officers were often on his payroll. Instead, investigators began to focus on an area Capone had largely ignored: taxes. The idea was simple. While it was difficult to prove murder or bootlegging in court, it was easier to prove that Capone lived far beyond the income he reported. The Internal Revenue Service quietly built a case, gathering evidence of his extravagant spending, luxury cars, fine suits, expensive homes, and constant gambling. At the same time, Capone's public image was undergoing a transformation. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had permanently darkened his reputation. Where once he was admired by some as a rebellious figure, now he was seen more clearly as a dangerous criminal. The Great Depression only deepened this shift. As families across America faced unemployment and hunger, Capone's displays of wealth seemed increasingly offensive. Even his charitable acts, such as the soup kitchens he funded, could not erase the growing resentment. Chicago's newspapers, once fascinated by his charm, began to demand stronger action against him. Meanwhile, Capone himself remained confident. He had survived assassination attempts, turf wars, and constant scrutiny. He believed money could solve almost any problem, whether through bribes, gifts, or carefully placed threats. Yet he also knew the pressure was mounting. Federal agents had begun to shadow him, recording his movements, interviewing associates, and slowly piecing together a case. In response, Capone occasionally sought to soften his image. He granted interviews, posed for photographs, and insisted he was simply a businessman meeting public demand. "I give the people what they want," he often said, framing himself as a provider rather than a criminal. But behind the words, his organization remained deeply violent, and his enemies, though weakened, still posed threats. Bugs Moran, though diminished after the massacre, continued to resist in smaller ways, and new figures tried to rise in the underworld. Capone, however, remained the central figure in Chicago, larger than life, a man whose every move captured headlines. For all his power, he could not see that the greatest danger was no longer bullets or rival gangs. It was paper, ledgers, and the quiet persistence of government accountants. The same empire that had made him rich and untouchable was also leaving behind traces that would become his undoing. In 1931, the campaign against Al Capone reached its decisive moment. For years, law enforcement had struggled to pin violent crimes on him, but the federal government now had a clear strategy: tax evasion. Investigators had gathered records of his lavish spending and evidence that he had never filed proper tax returns. The government prepared indictments, and for the first time, Capone faced charges he could not so easily dismiss with bribes or intimidation. When the news broke, it stunned the public. The most feared gangster in America was not being pursued for murder or bootlegging, but for failing to pay taxes. Capone at first dismissed the threat. He boasted that no jury would ever convict him, believing his money and influence could protect him as always. But the government had learned from past failures. They carefully selected jurors, keeping them away from bribery and threats, and built their case with meticulous detail. In October 1931, Capone's trial began in Chicago. The courtroom was filled with reporters, curious citizens, and officials eager to witness history. Capone entered wearing tailored suits and his familiar confidence, smiling to the crowd as if he were attending a social event rather than facing prison. The prosecution presented ledgers, receipts, and testimony from former associates who revealed the scale of his unreported income. The defense argued that Capone's business was too shadowy to prove exact earnings, but the evidence was overwhelming. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence was harsh: 11 years in federal prison, one of the longest ever given for tax crimes at the time. The announcement shocked Capone. For years he had lived as though untouchable, protected by money, fear, and fame. Now he was facing not only the loss of his empire, but the loss of his freedom. Newspapers across the country carried the headlines: the mighty king of Chicago had fallen, not by gunfire or rival gangs, but by accountants and lawyers. For many Americans, the conviction symbolized a victory of law over crime, proof that even the most powerful gangster could not escape justice forever. For Capone, it marked the beginning of a long and painful decline. He was only 32, still young by many standards, but his reign was effectively over. The man who had once ruled Chicago with charm and violence was now preparing for a very different life behind bars. Al Capone's sentencing in 1931 was more than just the fall of a gangster. It was the collapse of an empire. As he stood before the judge and heard the words, 11 years, the weight of the moment finally broke through his confidence. For years he had believed that money, charm, and intimidation would shield him, yet now he was powerless. His family wept, his men whispered in disbelief, and the reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for the next morning's papers. The image of Capone leaving the courthouse, still dressed sharply but with his head lowered, became symbolic of the law's victory over organized crime. He was sent first to Cook County Jail, then transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta to begin serving his sentence. Atlanta was tough, but Capone initially believed he could recreate some of his old comforts. Through bribery, he managed to obtain a larger cell, soft furnishings, and even access to special meals. Guards were not immune to his influence, and for a short time he lived more like a wealthy inmate than a prisoner. But his reputation followed him, and whispers about his privileges eventually reached higher authorities. Inmates who despised him for his arrogance and guards who resented his favoritism made his life increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, Capone's empire began to crumble. Without his leadership, rival gangs moved in to claim territory. The once carefully organized networks of bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering began to fracture. His closest lieutenants either fought among themselves or abandoned the cause altogether. The wealth and power that had once seemed endless evaporated in months. Yet prison life carried its own challenges beyond the loss of power. Capone's health, which had already begun to decline from untreated syphilis, grew worse. He suffered headaches, bouts of confusion, and sudden changes in mood. Though he tried to project strength, those close to him noticed his deterioration. By 1934, authorities decided to transfer him to the new maximum security prison at Alcatraz, a place designed to house the most dangerous criminals in America. For Capone, who had once ruled Chicago like a king, the move was devastating. At Alcatraz, there was no bribing guards, no special privileges, no luxuries. The cold winds off San Francisco Bay, the rigid discipline of the prison routine, and the isolation from the outside world broke down what remained of his pride. In those grey walls, Al Capone was no longer the feared Scarface or the King of Chicago. He was just another inmate, known by his number, serving time in silence. Alcatraz was unlike any prison Al Capone had ever known. Built on a rocky island surrounded by the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, it was designed to be escape-proof. For Capone, who had once lived surrounded by luxury, the harsh conditions came as a shock. His cell was small and bare, furnished only with a cot, a sink, and a toilet. Gone were the comforts he had managed to secure in Atlanta. At Alcatraz, every inmate was treated the same. The guards enforced strict routines, and Capone quickly realized that his money and reputation meant nothing here. He became inmate number 85, stripped of his identity as Scarface, stripped even of the aura that had once made him untouchable. Days at Alcatraz were long and monotonous. Prisoners rose early, performed assigned labour, and endured silence during meals. Capone was assigned to work in the laundry, scrubbing and folding clothes under the constant watch of guards. Though he had once commanded hundreds of men, he now spent his days in repetitive tasks, surrounded by hardened criminals who cared little for his past glory. Some inmates respected him for his reputation, but others resented the attention he attracted. Altercations occasionally broke out, and Capone learned to keep his head down to avoid further trouble. Yet what truly wore him down was not the labour, but the isolation. Letters from his wife, May, and his son, Sonny, arrived, but visits were rare and heavily supervised. The bustling life of Chicago, the empire he had built, the roar of speakeasies and the hum of his powerful cars all seemed like distant memories fading into silence. Meanwhile, his health continued to deteriorate. The untreated syphilis began to affect his mind, causing confusion, paranoia, and moments when he seemed to drift away from reality. Guards noted that sometimes he would hum songs to himself or sit quietly, staring at the walls for hours. For a man once feared across America, the decline was stark. Even his enemies, far from Alcatraz, must have felt that prison had done what bullets could not. It had broken Al Capone. Outside the prison, America was changing. Prohibition had ended in 1933, making much of the bootlegging that had built Capone's empire irrelevant. Organised crime shifted to new ventures, but Capone was no longer part of the world he once dominated. His empire dissolved, his name remained, but his power was gone. In the quiet, regimented life of Alcatraz, Capone was left with little more than memories, slowly slipping away as his mind and body weakened with each passing year. Life on Alcatraz slowly drained Al Capone of the energy and authority that had once defined him. The routines were relentless: early wake-ups, silent meals, work assignments, and strict head counts. For a man used to giving orders, the endless repetition of taking orders was perhaps the deepest humiliation. Capone's fellow inmates included bank robbers, kidnappers, and killers, men with their own reputations and grudges. Some respected his name, while others saw him as overrated, a man broken by illness and stripped of his power. The prison guards, aware of his fame, were careful not to let him regain influence. They denied him any special privileges, ensuring he remained simply another inmate. Capone spent much of his time in the laundry, labouring with soap, water, and heavy machines, his hands chapped and raw. The work was mind-numbing, but it left little room for thoughts of Chicago's nightlife or the empire that had once flowed through his hands. Over time, his illness grew worse. The syphilis that had been quietly eating away at him for years now attacked his nervous system. He became forgetful, sometimes unable to follow conversations. Inmates began to whisper that Scarface was losing his mind. Some described him as childlike, humming tunes to himself or repeating stories from the past as if he no longer understood where he was. Letters from May and Sonny continued to arrive, written with care and love, but Capone's replies grew shorter and more confused. His family worried, yet there was little they could do. Doctors in the prison offered basic care, but there was no cure for his condition. For the authorities, Capone was no longer the dangerous kingpin he had once been, but rather a sick man wasting away inside the most secure prison in America. Outside Alcatraz, the world had changed dramatically. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 ended the era that had allowed Capone to rise. Alcohol was legal again, and with it, the massive profits of bootlegging vanished. Organised crime shifted to gambling, labour racketeering, and new forms of vice. But Capone played no part in these developments. Younger, healthier men filled the vacuum he left behind. Newspapers occasionally still mentioned his name, often as a symbol of a bygone age, but his presence in the headlines was nothing like it had been during the height of his power. For many Americans, Scarface was already fading into legend while the man himself sat in a cold cell, his body weakening, his mind unravelling. By the late 1930s, it was clear that Capone's reign was not only over but almost forgotten, replaced by stories of new figures in the underworld. By 1938, Al Capone was a shadow of the man who had once ruled Chicago. At Alcatraz, his illness had advanced to the point where he struggled with even the simplest tasks. Fellow inmates noticed that his sharpness was gone. He often repeated himself, forgot instructions, and seemed confused about time and place. Some said he would pace the yard, humming old Italian songs, while others recalled him speaking about Chicago as if he were still in control of its streets. For a man once feared across America, it was a painful decline. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with neurosyphilis, acknowledging that his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Reports suggested his cognitive abilities had regressed so severely that he had the mind of a child. The transformation shocked those who remembered his violent reign, but within prison walls, it was simply another reminder of how fragile power could be. By this time, even the authorities recognized that Capone was no longer a threat. He was transferred out of Alcatraz in 1939, first to Terminal Island in California, then back to Atlanta. The decision was based on his worsening health, as prison officials feared he might not survive the harsh conditions of Alcatraz. Outside the prison system, his empire had long since collapsed. Other mob leaders had divided the spoils of Chicago, and new names dominated the underworld. To them, Capone was a relic, a figure who belonged to an earlier chapter of organized crime. Still, his name carried weight in the public imagination. For ordinary people, he remained the symbol of an era when gangsters openly ruled cities and defied the law with impunity. When news spread of his decline, it was met with a mix of disbelief and fascination. Could it really be true that the mighty Scarface, who once commanded armies of men and millions of dollars, was now little more than a broken patient? His wife May remained loyal throughout. She visited him regularly, shielding him from the harshest judgments of the outside world. His son, Sonny, grew up largely in his mother's care, away from the violence that had defined his father's legacy. For them, Al Capone was not just a gangster, but a husband and father, a man whose humanity was often overlooked in the sensational headlines. By 1940, after serving nearly 8 years of his sentence, Capone was released on parole. His health had declined so severely that officials deemed him no longer a danger to society. At just 41 years old, he returned to his family home in Florida, not as the feared ruler of Chicago, but as a sick, weakened man whose greatest battles were now with his own body and mind. When Al Capone left prison in 1940, the world he returned to was unrecognizable. The gangster wars of Chicago were over, prohibition had ended, and the new decade was shaped by looming global conflict rather than the battles of speakeasies and bootleggers. Capone, once the most feared man in America, was released into obscurity. His health was so damaged by neurosyphilis that he required constant care. May, his devoted wife, took him to their estate in Palm Island, Florida, a luxurious property that seemed far removed from the cold cells of Alcatraz. There, surrounded by palm trees and warm breezes, Capone began the final chapter of his life. The mansion was spacious, with wide porches and a view of Biscayne Bay, but it was not a palace of power. Instead, it became more of a refuge, a place where his family could shield him from the public eye. Those who visited often remarked on how diminished he seemed. The once sharp-eyed gangster who had commanded armies of men now struggled to follow conversations, drifting between moments of clarity and long periods of confusion. At times, he lived in the past, speaking of old associates as if they were still alive, or recalling events as though they had just happened. Yet there were also moments of peace. Capone enjoyed fishing in the bay, sometimes sitting for hours with a line in the water, content in the quiet rhythm of the waves. Neighbours would occasionally see him walking slowly through the gardens, dressed in casual clothes rather than the fine suits that had once been his trademark. Though his name still carried an air of legend, the man himself had become almost unrecognizable. Newspapers occasionally published stories about his decline, framing him as a fallen king, a reminder of how power fades. Some articles described him as harmless, living out his days like a retired old man rather than a former ruler of Chicago's underworld. For the public, the contrast was striking. Al Capone, who had once been untouchable, was now reduced to a life of quiet seclusion. Still, within his family there remained affection. May cared for him tirelessly, ensuring he was comfortable and shielded from cruelty. His son Sonny, though living his own life, stayed connected, offering the stability that Capone could no longer provide. The Palm Island home became not just a sanctuary but also a symbol of the final transformation of Scarface, from the feared gangster to a sick man living out his last years in fragile peace. Though illness had stolen his power, it could not erase the legend that clung to his name. Even in his silence, Al Capone remained one of the most famous figures in American history, his story etched into the memory of a nation. In the quiet surroundings of Palm Island, Al Capone lived a life far removed from the chaos of Chicago streets. The warm Florida air, the swaying palms, and the gentle sound of waves were a stark contrast to the gunfire and sirens that had once defined his world. Yet even in this calm setting, his decline was evident. Visitors described him as slow and often detached, no longer the calculating man who once ruled an empire. Sometimes he would sit for hours on the veranda, staring out across Biscayne Bay, lost in thought or memory. Those closest to him noted that he still had flashes of his old personality. There were moments when he laughed heartily at a joke, moments when his charm seemed to resurface, as if Scarface himself briefly returned. But these moments were fleeting. Much of the time he struggled with confusion, forgetting names, places, or the very year he was living in. Doctors confirmed that his syphilis had advanced into late-stage neurosyphilis, leaving permanent damage. Capone's reputation continued to intrigue the public. Occasionally, reporters attempted to catch glimpses of him, hoping for a story. But May kept a tight circle around her husband, limiting access and protecting his dignity. She was determined that the world would not see him broken and vulnerable, even if whispers about his condition spread. Instead, she presented the image of a devoted wife caring for a man who, despite his crimes, remained her family. Meanwhile, America itself was moving on. World War II dominated headlines, and Capone was no longer the centre of attention. Younger gangsters had taken over Chicago's underworld, adapting to new opportunities. To them, Capone was history, a figure of another era. Yet in popular culture, his legend grew. Books, articles, and even films drew inspiration from his life, often blending fact with myth. The idea of Al Capone became larger than the man himself, a symbol of both the glamour and brutality of organised crime. In his Palm Island retreat, Capone lived in relative isolation, shielded from the world that continued to spin without him. His health worsened year by year. He suffered strokes, further weakening his body, and infections that left him bedridden for long stretches. May remained constant, ensuring he was comfortable, surrounding him with care and quiet devotion. Though his empire had dissolved and his power vanished, Al Capone still carried the aura of a story unfinished. Those who saw him could not help but remember the man he had been, the sharp-dressed, confident king of Chicago, while facing the fragile, fading figure he had become. His final years were marked not by violence or ambition, but by silence, reflection, and the slow passage of time in the Florida sun. By the early 1940s, Al Capone's world had shrunk to the walls of his Palm Island home. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of wealth and triumph, had become both a sanctuary and a prison. Each day followed a similar pattern: short walks in the garden, simple meals, long hours of rest, and occasional fishing trips when his health allowed. His wife May ensured the household remained calm, protecting him from the outside world and the constant curiosity that his name still generated. Despite her efforts, rumours spread about his condition. Some newspapers described him as a recluse, while others painted lurid pictures of a once great gangster, reduced to childlike simplicity. The truth was somewhere in between. Capone was not entirely gone. He had moments of clarity, moments when he spoke with warmth to his family or recalled vivid details from his past. Yet those moments were increasingly rare, overshadowed by long stretches of confusion. Doctors confirmed that his mind had been permanently damaged, and while they could manage his symptoms, there was no cure. Outside the mansion, America was changing rapidly. World War II was reshaping society, and stories of Chicago's old gang wars felt distant compared to the headlines of global conflict. Still, Capone's legend endured in whispers. In bars and clubs, men told tales of Scarface, the gangster who had defied the law and ruled a city. His name had become folklore, inspiring both fear and fascination, even as the man himself sat quietly in Florida, fading into obscurity. For his family, the contrast was painful. May shouldered the burden of care with quiet strength, while Sonny, now grown, visited his father but often left with a heavy heart. The once dominant figure who had towered over Chicago's streets was now a fragile patient, dependent on others for even the simplest needs. Neighbours occasionally glimpsed him outside, dressed casually, moving slowly with help. Some found it hard to believe that this was the same man who had once commanded an empire of crime and wealth. Yet perhaps that was the final irony of Al Capone's life. The law had imprisoned him, illness had broken him, and time had turned him into a figure both pitied and remembered. In many ways, his decline was more powerful than any courtroom verdict. It showed that even the most feared men are not immune to the forces of age and disease. In Palm Island's quiet, Capone lived out his days not as a king, but as a reminder of how fragile power can be, how swiftly empires rise and fall, and how legends often outlive the men who inspire them. As the 1940s moved forward, Al Capone's retreat into obscurity deepened. The Palm Island estate, with its tropical gardens and grand architecture, had once been intended as a showpiece of success. Now it served as a quiet refuge for a man whose body and mind were steadily unravelling. Capone spent much of his time on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair, gazing at the waters of Biscayne Bay. Sometimes he fished, though more often he simply let the line dangle while he drifted in thought. Neighbours who caught sight of him were struck by how ordinary he seemed, dressed in loose shirts and straw hats, moving slowly without the commanding presence that had once defined him. To many, it was hard to reconcile this fading figure with the Scarface of legend. Inside the home, May managed the household with unwavering devotion. She shielded her husband from reporters, turning away requests for interviews and protecting his dignity. Sonny, now an adult, visited and offered companionship, though the conversations were often one-sided. Capone would repeat the same stories from his youth, or fall into long silences. His illness had robbed him of consistency, leaving him alternating between fleeting moments of clarity and stretches of confusion. Doctors who examined him reported that his mental capacity had diminished to that of a young child. Despite this, Capone still found small joys. He enjoyed listening to music, especially the swing tunes of the era, tapping his foot lightly to the rhythm. On good days he played cards with family members, though he sometimes forgot the rules. The grandeur of his past meant little in these moments. What mattered were the simple comforts that remained within his reach. Meanwhile, the world beyond Palm Island was gripped by World War II. Newspapers focused on battles overseas, victories and losses, rationing and sacrifice. In this new world of global conflict, Capone's story seemed like a relic of another time. Yet his name never disappeared completely. Journalists still referenced him as the archetype of the American gangster, and Hollywood began weaving elements of his life into films that shaped the image of organised crime for generations. For the public, Scarface was not the man fishing quietly in Florida, but the legend who had ruled Chicago with both charm and terror. That separation between the myth and the reality only grew wider as his health declined. In truth, Al Capone had become powerless, living under the care of his family, waiting as illness slowly dimmed his final years. Still, the legend endured, larger than life, ensuring that even in decline, his story would never be forgotten. By the mid-1940s, Al Capone's days had settled into a quiet rhythm, far removed from the chaos of his earlier life. The Palm Island estate was large and beautiful, but it no longer served as a place of grandeur or celebration. Instead, it was a retreat, a place where Capone's family shielded him from the public eye while his illness ran its course. Each morning he rose late, moving slowly with help from May or attendants, and often sat outdoors in the sun. The tropical heat seemed to comfort him, and he would sometimes smile at the sight of passing boats or seabirds flying overhead. He no longer concerned himself with business or power. His empire was long gone, absorbed by rivals and new generations of gangsters who saw themselves as more sophisticated, more modern. Capone, once feared and admired, was no longer part of their world. What remained was the man himself, diminished, but not entirely erased. On some days, flashes of the old Al Capone surfaced. He might recall with surprising clarity a night in Chicago, the names of men long dead, or the music that filled speakeasies during Prohibition. In those moments, his voice carried the same confidence it once had, as though Scarface had returned for an instant. But soon the fog of his illness would descend again, leaving him confused or silent. May, patient and devoted, stayed by his side through it all. She managed visitors carefully, allowing only close friends or family to see him, and always ensuring that his dignity remained intact. To the outside world, she presented the image of a loyal wife protecting her husband from intrusion, though the reality was far more difficult. Caring for Capone required strength and constant attention. His behaviour was unpredictable, sometimes gentle and affectionate, sometimes irritable and restless. Sonny, now building his own life, continued to visit, but it was clear that the father he remembered was slipping away. Meanwhile, the world beyond Palm Island was reshaping itself. Organised crime had not disappeared with Prohibition's end. It had adapted, moving into labour unions, gambling operations, and new forms of racketeering. Federal authorities shifted their focus, battling emerging syndicates. Capone's name, however, remained ever present in American culture. His story was retold in newspapers, novels, and early films, shaping the myth of the gangster as both glamorous and dangerous. For many Americans, Capone's life symbolized an era when crime seemed larger than life, when gangsters ruled cities and defied the law openly. But the man himself, sitting quietly in Florida, was far from the myth. He had become a symbol in history while living as an invalid in reality. His days measured not in power or money, but in small comforts and fading memories. As the years drifted into the late 1940s, Al Capone's presence on Palm Island became more ghost-like than legendary. Visitors who managed to glimpse him often remarked at how ordinary, even fragile, he appeared. He was heavier than in his prime, his once sharp eyes dulled by illness, and his movements slow and uncertain. The man who had once dominated Chicago's streets with authority now shuffled across the verandas of his Florida home like a tired retiree. Yet the aura of his name persisted. Reporters continued to send inquiries, and tourists passing through Miami sometimes pointed across the water, whispering about Scarface living in seclusion just beyond their view. To the public, he remained a figure of intrigue. To those inside his home, he was simply Al, a husband and father in decline. May Capone remained a pillar of strength. Her loyalty never wavered, even as the burden of care grew heavier. She organised the household around her husband's needs, making sure he had comfort and privacy. She shielded him from sensationalist reporters who sought to expose his weakness, insisting that what remained of his dignity be preserved. Sonny, his only son, visited when he could, balancing his own adult life with the responsibility of being part of a family bound by notoriety. For Capone himself, the days blurred together. Sometimes he sat outdoors, staring at the horizon for hours, humming quietly or speaking in fragments about Chicago nights and faces long gone. At other times he seemed unaware of his surroundings, content only in the rhythm of rocking chairs and the sound of palm leaves rustling in the breeze. Doctors continued to monitor him, but by then it was clear that little could be done. The neurosyphilis had caused permanent brain damage, and though treatments existed, they were too late to reverse the years of decline. Capone's condition became a symbol in itself, the mighty gangster brought down not by bullets or betrayals, but by an illness silently gnawing away at him until he was unrecognizable. Beyond Palm Island, his legend grew larger with each passing year. Writers and filmmakers seized on his story, blending truth and fiction into myths that fascinated audiences. Gangster characters on screen often carried shades of Capone, his charisma, his ruthlessness, his contradictions. In many ways, the cultural image of the gangster was shaped more by Scarface than by anyone else. Yet the man himself was fading. In the quiet of his Florida home, his empire was long gone, his rivals either dead or forgotten, and his own mind drifting further from the reality around him. By the end of the decade, Al Capone existed in two worlds at once, one of myth, growing stronger with time, and one of reality, where he was simply a sick man, living out his last years in the shadows of memory and silence. By 1946, Al Capone's health had deteriorated so much that his family sought expert evaluations from physicians outside the prison system. When doctors examined him, they confirmed what May already knew. The damage to his brain was irreversible. One specialist famously remarked that Capone's mental capacity was equal to that of a 12-year-old child. The diagnosis was devastating, not because it revealed anything new, but because it put into words what his loved ones had been witnessing for years. Capone, once a man of immense cunning and presence, was now reduced to a state of dependency. Despite this, life on Palm Island continued in its quiet rhythm. Capone spent long hours sitting by the water, sometimes speaking in half-finished sentences, sometimes retreating entirely into silence. On rare days, he became animated, recalling details of his youth in Brooklyn or boasting about imagined victories in Chicago. Those around him learned to nod, to listen, to let him wander through memories that were often fractured or distorted. May remained by his side, unwavering in her devotion. She managed the estate, organised staff, and ensured her husband was treated with respect, even in his most vulnerable moments. For her, the story was not about Scarface the gangster, but about Al, the man she had married, the father of her child. Her loyalty, tested by decades of chaos, remained constant to the end. The wider world, meanwhile, treated Capone as both a curiosity and a relic. Journalists occasionally published sensational stories about his decline, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened. Headlines described the once feared gangster as harmless, living like an old man lost in time. Tourists in Miami continued to whisper about him, some even boating past the Palm Island estate in hopes of catching a glimpse. For organised crime, his absence was complete. New leaders had risen in Chicago and across the nation, men who had learned from Capone's successes and mistakes. They operated with more discretion, less eager to court the public eye. The lessons of Scarface were clear. Power built on violence and spectacle could not last forever. In this way, even in decline, Capone influenced the underworld he had left behind. By the end of the 1940s, his days were marked by repetition and fragility. Fishing poles leaned against the porch, though he rarely had the strength to use them. Swing music played softly from radios, sometimes sparking a smile or a tap of his hand. The empire he had once ruled was gone, but his legend, ironically, was larger than ever. To the public, Scarface was eternal. To his family, he was a fading presence. A man caught between memory and silence, waiting quietly for the final chapter of his extraordinary tragic life. The final years of the 1940s brought Al Capone deeper into seclusion. Palm Island was his world now, a quiet space that shielded him from the relentless curiosity of the outside. His decline had become a story in itself, whispered about in bars, reported in newspapers, and woven into the growing mythology of the gangster era. But inside the estate, life was simple, even repetitive. Capone rose late, often disoriented, needing assistance from attendants. Meals were modest, chosen more for his health than for indulgence. Sometimes he walked slowly through the gardens, leaning on canes or the arm of a caretaker, while the Florida sun cast long shadows across the property. He still enjoyed music, especially the jazz and swing tunes that reminded him of his younger years, though often he seemed to drift into reverie, humming along as if transported back to the roaring nights of Chicago. His family maintained a careful barrier between him and the world. May was vigilant in protecting her husband's dignity, refusing interviews and discouraging photographs. She allowed only trusted visitors into the home, and even they often left with heavy hearts, shaken by how far the mighty Scarface had fallen. The contrast between the legend and the man before them was stark. a figure once larger than life now diminished, frail, and lost in fragments of memory. Sonny, living his own quiet life, remained present, though the conversations with his father were increasingly one-sided. Capone sometimes recognized him, sometimes did not. At times he spoke as if Sonny were still a child, at other times forgetting entirely who sat before him. For Sonny, these visits were bittersweet, filled with loyalty and love, but also with the painful knowledge that his father, though alive, was no longer truly there. Meanwhile, America was moving quickly into a new age. Organized crime evolved, with national syndicates forming under leaders like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. These men had learned from Capone's downfall, choosing to operate in the shadows rather than the spotlight. To law enforcement, the lesson was equally clear. Flamboyant gangsters who flaunted their wealth would always draw attention, but networks that stayed quiet could thrive undisturbed. In this sense, Capone's decline had reshaped the entire underworld. Yet for the public, he remained the symbol of the gangster era, the face that defined prohibition and its violence. His story was retold endlessly, exaggerated in pulp magazines and adapted for Hollywood screens. Children who had never known prohibition still recognized the name Scarface. Inside Palm Island, however, there was no glamour, no empire, no myth. Only an ailing man surrounded by family slowly fading away. The legend continued to grow outside while the reality withered quietly within the walls of his Florida home. By the dawn of the 1950s, Al Capone's story had become almost two separate tales. The living man hidden away in Florida, and the myth of Scarface that continued to grow across the nation. In his Palm Island estate, Capone spent his days in a haze of illness. Doctors described him as docile, often childlike, with his mind slipping further away from reality. He would sometimes play with grandchildren of family friends as if he were one of them, laughing at simple games, unaware of how much his condition startled visitors who remembered his notorious past. The man once capable of ruthless decisions now lived in a state of fragile innocence. May kept their household quiet, surrounding him with comfort and routine. She ensured meals were on time, music played softly, and the atmosphere remained calm. Nurses rotated through the home providing medical care while May acted as both wife and guardian, shielding him from embarrassment. To the world outside, however, Capone was still a figure of fascination. Newspapers occasionally published photographs of the mansion, reminding readers that the most famous gangster in America was still alive, though barely present. Some articles treated him with pity, portraying him as a broken man undone by disease. Others maintained the darker edge, suggesting that no amount of illness could erase the shadow of the crimes he'd committed. Either way, his name continued to sell papers. In popular culture, his legend thrived. Hollywood produced gangster films that borrowed elements from his life, blending fact with fiction until it became difficult for audiences to separate the two. Writers cast him as both villain and tragic figure, a man who rose too high and fell too far. For a new generation that had not lived through Prohibition, Capone was already more character than person, an archetype of American crime. Inside his home, none of that mattered. Capone no longer followed the news or understood the world beyond his gardens. The empire he had built, the wars he had fought, the power he had once wielded, all of it seemed distant, if not erased completely from his mind. Instead, his days were filled with the small comforts of routine. Fishing poles left untouched by the water's edge, quiet evenings on the porch, and the gentle presence of May nearby. His decline, while tragic, carried a certain peace. The violence and chaos that had once defined his existence were gone, replaced by silence and care. In those final years, Al Capone became not the king of Chicago, but a reminder of how swiftly power fades, how legends endure while the men behind them slowly disappear into memory. As the early 1950s unfolded, Al Capone's health grew increasingly fragile. He suffered from frequent infections, his body weakened, and his mind continued its slow decline. Visitors often described him as gentle, even pleasant, though his speech was fragmented and his thoughts wandered unpredictably. Sometimes he greeted old friends warmly, speaking as if no years had passed, but within minutes he might forget who they were. The man who had once memorized entire city maps of Chicago, who had orchestrated vast criminal enterprises with precision, now struggled to recall simple details of daily life. May maintained her tireless devotion, ensuring her husband was never alone. She hired nurses, coordinated medical care, and managed the estate, all while deflecting outside attention. Reporters still circled occasionally, hoping to capture the image of the fallen gangster, but May kept them away. She insisted that Al be remembered not for his decline, but for the man he had been to his family. Sonny, though grown and independent, continued to visit. For him, these visits were filled with both loyalty and sadness. His father was still alive, yet the sharp, commanding presence of his youth was gone. Conversations often looped, with Al repeating stories from decades earlier, speaking of Torrio, O'Banion or Cicero as though the Prohibition Wars were still raging. At times he seemed trapped in the past, living inside memories that blurred fact and imagination. Outside Palm Island, the legend of Scarface took on a life of its own. Books about the gangster era were published, often exaggerating Capone's role or inventing colourful details to feed public appetite. Films painted him as both villain and tragic anti-hero, cementing his place in American folklore. For the younger generation, Al Capone was not a sick man in Florida, but a towering symbol of defiance, wealth, and violence. This divide between myth and reality grew wider with each year. The real Capone's days were quiet, measured by the ticking of clocks and the routine of care, while the myth grew ever louder in theatres, newspapers and conversations across the nation. By 1952, Capone's health took another downturn. Strokes further weakened his body, leaving him partially paralysed at times. His doctors warned May that the end was approaching, though it might still be months or even years away. May, steadfast as ever, refused to abandon hope. She surrounded her husband with comfort. Soft music, warm meals, and gentle company. In these final years, Capone was no longer the king of Chicago, but a fading figure whose legend had already eclipsed his life. He remained alive in body, but in spirit he was already part of history, a reminder that power, no matter how immense, is always temporary. By 1953, Al Capone's condition had worsened to the point where even short walks around his estate became impossible. He spent much of his time indoors, seated in large chairs or confined to bed, his body weakened and his mind often far away. Nurses cared for him constantly, while May managed the household with quiet determination. She rarely left his side for long, insisting that even in his confusion, her husband deserved dignity and love. Capone's conversations grew increasingly fragmented. Sometimes he spoke of Chicago as if he still ruled its streets, describing meetings with men long dead, or recounting deals that had ended decades earlier. At other times he was almost silent, his thoughts drifting beyond reach. Doctors noted that his lucidity came in brief flashes, moments when his eyes lit up and he seemed aware, speaking with warmth to May or Sonny. But these moments were fleeting, soon overtaken by the fog of neurosyphilis. Despite his frailty, Capone continued to find comfort in simple pleasures. Music remained a constant companion. Jazz and swing records played softly in the background, and on good days he tapped his fingers to the rhythm. Occasionally, he asked for fishing gear to be set up near the water, though he no longer had the strength to hold a rod. Just sitting by the bay, feeling the breeze and hearing the water lap against the shore seemed to calm him. Meanwhile, the outside world had moved far beyond the gangster era. America was entering a period of post-war prosperity, suburban expansion, and cultural change. Organised crime still existed, but it was quieter, less flamboyant, run by syndicates who had learned to avoid the spotlight that had doomed Capone. Still, his legend lived on. Hollywood films drew inspiration from his life, often exaggerating or distorting events to create dramatic narratives. For audiences who had never known prohibition, Capone was both villain and folk hero, a figure larger than life whose story seemed almost mythical. This contrast between legend and reality remained striking. The myth of Scarface roared in theatres, while the real Al Capone sat quietly in Florida, childlike in thought, fragile in body, and dependent on those around him. May never allowed this contrast to embitter her. She remained steadfast, devoted, and protective, refusing to let her husband's decline overshadow the life they had built together. To her, he was not merely the world's most infamous gangster, but the man she had loved since youth. In this devotion, Capone found his final refuge. His empire was gone, his rivals forgotten, but in May's care and Sonny's visits, he retained the one thing that even illness could not strip away: his family's enduring loyalty. By 1954, Al Capone had become almost completely detached from the world around him. His body was frail, his movements slow, and his mind clouded by years of illness. He no longer had the energy for long walks or even for fishing, which had once brought him peace. Most days were spent indoors, either resting in bed or sitting quietly in a chair, watching sunlight filter through the windows of his Palm Island home. Nurses attended to him constantly, ensuring he was comfortable, while May hovered nearby, guiding the rhythms of the household with quiet resolve. Though his days were uneventful, Capone's name remained ever present in the world outside. Hollywood films about gangsters continued to draw inspiration from his life, shaping the image of organized crime for audiences who had never lived through the 1920s. Newspapers occasionally revisited his story, framing him as both a cautionary tale and a cultural icon. For younger generations, he had become less a real person than a symbol. Scarface, the archetype of the gangster, larger than life, untouchable, and yet ultimately undone. The reality was far different. In his home, Capone often behaved like a child. He needed reminders for meals, help with clothing, and patience when his memory faltered. Sometimes he spoke of his past as though it were still present, recalling names and events with startling detail, only to drift moments later into confusion. Nurses and family members learned to accept these fluctuations, cherishing the rare flashes of clarity. May's devotion never wavered. She shielded her husband fiercely, refusing to let outsiders see him in such a vulnerable state. To her, Al was still the man she had married, still worthy of care and respect despite all that had changed. Her loyalty was both remarkable and quiet, expressed in daily acts of protection and tenderness. Sonny too visited, though the conversations with his father were one-sided. At times, Capone seemed to recognize him, smiling or calling his name. At others, he appeared lost, speaking of Sonny as a boy rather than the grown man before him. For Sonny, these visits were bittersweet, filled with love, but tinged with the pain of watching a parent fade away. Outside, organized crime had moved on. Figures like Frank Costello and later Vito Genovese now defined the landscape of the underworld. They operated differently, less flashy, more calculated, having learned from Capone's mistakes. Yet none carried the same cultural weight. Scarface remained the name most Americans associated with gangsters, even as the man himself lived out his final years in obscurity and decline. The contrast was profound. The legend thrived, while the reality slipped further into silence. By 1955, Al Capone's decline had reached its final stage. His health was failing rapidly, and he now relied entirely on the care of nurses and the constant attention of May. The once mighty gangster, who had orchestrated vast networks of power and profit, could barely manage the simplest tasks. His speech was slurred, his memory unreliable, and his body weakened from years of illness. Yet even in this fragile state, there remained glimpses of the man he had been. On rare occasions, Capone would smile with sudden recognition, speaking of old friends, or recalling a song from his youth. These moments, fleeting though they were, offered comfort to his family, reminders that beneath the illness still lingered the man they had loved. May continued her tireless devotion, refusing to allow outsiders to see him in this diminished condition. She created a protective cocoon within the Palm Island estate where the world's curiosity could not intrude. For her, Capone was not the figure of legend or scandal, but her husband, deserving of dignity even as his strength disappeared. Sonny visited when possible, though the conversations were more gestures of love than true exchanges. Capone's recognition of his son came and went like shifting tides. Sometimes he addressed him warmly, other times confusing him with someone from the past. Still, Sonny remained present, his loyalty as steadfast as his mother's. Outside the mansion, Capone's legend only grew stronger. Writers and filmmakers continued to retell his story, often exaggerating or inventing details to feed the public's fascination. Scarface had become less a man than a myth, representing the excess, violence and charisma of the gangster era. For audiences who had never known Prohibition, Capone was almost a fictional figure, a character larger than life. Yet within the quiet rooms of Palm Island, the myth had no power. The real Al Capone lived out his final days surrounded by silence, cared for tenderly by those who refused to abandon him. His empire was long gone, his rivals buried or forgotten, but his story had already taken root in the imagination of a nation. By the mid-1950s, it was clear to doctors that his time was limited. His body weakened further, and his mind slipped into longer stretches of confusion. May, though weary, never let her devotion falter. To the end, she shielded him from indignity, determined that his last chapter be one of care rather than spectacle. In this way, Capone's final years were marked not by violence or power, but by the quiet persistence of family love, a softer ending to a life that had once burned so fiercely across the stage of American history. By January of 1947, Al Capone's fragile health finally reached its breaking point. Though only 48 years old, he appeared far older, his body worn by years of illness, and his mind weakened beyond repair. On January 21st, he suffered a massive stroke at his Palm Island estate. The attack left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. Doctors rushed to his bedside, doing what they could, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. Just as it seemed he might stabilize, pneumonia set in, weakening him further. May remained constantly by his side, holding his hand, refusing to leave even for rest. She had stood beside him through his rise and fall, through scandal, prison and sickness, and now she stood guard in his final days, protecting his dignity as fiercely as ever. Sonny came too to sit quietly with his father. For the family, the once powerful man before them now seemed like a shadow, but their love did not waver. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest, 4 days after his stroke. The news spread instantly across the country. Headlines screamed of Scarface's death, and newspapers filled with reflections on his life. For some, he remained the ruthless gangster who had brought violence and fear to Chicago. For others, he was a symbol of an era long past, a man who had embodied both the glamour and brutality of Prohibition. Crowds gathered outside his Palm Island home, drawn not by grief but by curiosity, wanting to witness the end of a legend. In Chicago, memories resurfaced. Older citizens recalled the gunfire that had once echoed through their streets, the speakeasies hidden behind ordinary doors, the politicians and policemen whose loyalty had been bought with bribes. For them, Capone's death was the closing of a turbulent chapter in their city's history. In Miami, the funeral was private. May insisted on keeping it small, attended only by family and a handful of close friends. She wanted no circus, no spectacle, only peace. Capone's body was first buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, alongside his father and brother. Later, his remains were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where they still rest. Even in death, Capone remained a figure of fascination. Journalists wrote endless retrospectives, historians debated his impact, and ordinary Americans told stories of Scarface as though he were a character in folklore. The reality of the man, a son of immigrants, a husband, a father, a patient ravaged by disease, was often overshadowed by the legend of the gangster who had ruled Chicago. Yet both realities remained true, woven together in the story of a life that seemed larger than life itself. The death of Al Capone in January 1947 closed a chapter in American history, yet his story never truly ended. In the decades that followed, his name only grew more legendary, woven into the fabric of popular culture, history books, and the American imagination. To some, he remained the ruthless gangster, remembered for the St. Valentine's Day massacre, for corruption, for blood spilled on Chicago's streets. To others, he was the symbol of prohibition itself, a man who supplied what the public wanted when the law tried to deny it. His legend straddled the line between villain and folk hero, ensuring that his shadow lingered long after his body was laid to rest. Historians often debated his true impact. Some argued that Capone was less a mastermind and more a product of his time, an ambitious young man who rose because prohibition created a black market ripe for exploitation. Others saw him as a uniquely charismatic leader who understood both fear and loyalty, someone able to bend a great city to his will. Whichever view one took, there was no denying that he had left a mark not only on Chicago, but on the nation. Capone's name became shorthand for gangster, his image immortalized in photographs of tailored suits, fedoras, and confident smirks. Hollywood embraced him, creating countless characters inspired by Scarface. Movies and novels exaggerated his story, turning him into a figure larger than life, sometimes monstrous, sometimes tragic, but always unforgettable. Even as the real man faded into history, the myth endured, evolving with each retelling. For Chicago, his era was both a wound and a warning. The violence of the 1920s scarred the city, and the corruption that allowed him to thrive left a legacy of mistrust. Yet Chicago also became known worldwide as the city of Capone, a place forever tied to the roaring 20s jazz and speakeasies. Tourists came seeking traces of his world, standing outside old haunts and imagining the days when Scarface ruled. For his family, the story was far more personal. May lived quietly until her death in 1986, never remarrying, always protective of her husband's memory. Sonny, too, kept a low profile, building his own life away from the glare of history. For them, Capone was not a legend, but a husband and father, flawed and broken, but loved nonetheless. In this private devotion lay another truth of his life, one often overshadowed by the violence and myth. Ultimately, Al Capone's story was one of contrasts. He was a man of generosity and brutality, of charm and menace, of immense power and utter vulnerability. He rose higher than most could imagine, only to fall further than most could endure. His empire, once vast, crumbled, but his name never disappeared. Even now, generations later, Scarface remains a symbol of ambition unchecked, of law challenged, of a time when gangsters ruled cities. The real man died in silence in Florida, but the legend lives on, reminding us that history often remembers not the truth in full, but the stories that capture the imagination.